Good morning, everybody, and thank you to those of you who are in the room with us in the cold Cape Town, and to those of you who are online with us from all over the world. Welcome to the latest in a series of seminars that are being hosted by the Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance, looking at leadership and leadership in different contexts related to this huge challenge we face all over the world of good democratic governance that delivers on the needs of populations all over the world. Today's seminar is specifically looking at this question of leadership through the lens of a critical player in democratic governance, and that is civil society. And I say a critical player in democratic governance because although civil society is a non-state actor, its work is vital to effective, good, accountable, transparent governance that delivers on people's needs. So for that reason, we have called today's webinar State CSO Relations, Reigniting Social Movements in the Era of Authoritarianism and Polarization. Now, whether the problem is reigniting social movements or whether the problem is about the power, leadership, direction, and purpose of social movements is something that will, I think, emerge from our discussion. And I think to that end, we're very privileged this morning that we have three really excellent panelists to present to this discussion. And they will present, I think, quite diverse perspectives and experiences that reflect that we are not in one world, but in many worlds when it comes to civil society and the state. We're in a world where in some countries there is closing civic space. In some countries there is no civic space and no relations between the state and civil society. And in some countries like South Africa, there appears to be the semblance of a reopening of civic space after the general election that took place a few weeks ago. So let me just quickly introduce our three panelists. The first speaker this morning will be Brian Raftopoulos, sitting with me in the room on my right. There's a brief bio of Brian on the screen. I just want to say that Brian is an adjunct professor at the Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance, but I think as importantly, Brian is a treasure trove of experience and hands-on knowledge on the situation in Zimbabwe and Southern Africa, where he has been a writer, an academic, but also a practitioner for, I don't know, probably 40 years or something. I don't want to give away Brian's age, but he's been around for a long time. Brian will be followed, and Brian will speak to us, bringing the perspective, particularly of what is happening around state civil society relations in Zimbabwe and in Southern Africa. Brian will be followed by Tanya Haddad. Tanya is coming to us from Beirut in Lebanon. Thank you, Tanya, very much for your time this morning. And Tanya is an associate professor of public administration at the American University of Beirut. But she's also somebody who has written and thought deeply about this issue of civil society and the role of civil society in relation to governance and in relation to social justice. And Tanya will be speaking specifically on the role of civil society in relation to weak and authoritarian states, and as I understand it, specifically using the example of the Beirut explosion several years ago. So thank you, Tanya. And then Tanya will be followed by Sibongile Ndashe. Sibongile is a feminist lawyer. She's the founder and executive director of a very important organization called the Initiative for Strategic Litigation in Africa. And her work has been around human rights, but human rights particularly from the lens of gender, particularly from the lens of building a pool of feminist and movement lawyers in South Africa, in Africa, not South Africa. And Sibongile will be our third presenter and will bring a gendered lens, but also looking at the issues of the African Union, human rights and gender in Africa. So that's a very diverse set of perspectives. Each speaker will speak for between 10 and 15 minutes, and that will allow us about 45 minutes for conversation after this. Once the speakers have finished, I will just facilitate a short discussion on themes that may have emerged, common themes out of their presentations, but then we will also be open to short input and any questions from people who are in the room and online with us, and then we'll go back to the speakers for a final wrap-up just before 12 o'clock. So thank you. I won't say any more for the moment, and I will hand over to the first presenter this morning, Brian Raftopoulos. Thank you very much, Brian.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you for that lovely introduction, and welcome to you all. I think that getting straight to the point here, one of the major issues we face in the region is the crisis of post-liberation societies. Liberation movements who are facing a challenge of how to transform into democratic states. And this, I'll speak specifically about Zimbabwe, but then try and reflect broader on the region. I mean, what we've seen in Zimbabwe is a state coming out of a liberation movement which feels it has the eternal right to rule, unfortunately. A state which has increasingly become authoritarian in its modes of operation and has closed down space repeatedly. Most recently, we've seen a number of strategies used to close down space. One, firstly, is the systematic dismantling of the formal opposition in parliament through the infiltration of that opposition, but also through the removal of democratically elected parliamentarians through legislative manipulation, the use of the judiciary. In terms of civil society, a number of areas that they've had problems they've had to face. One is the legislation again. Some key legislative initiatives that have come about. The Patriot Act, which effectively bans civil society organizations from speaking to foreign bodies, and critically speaking to foreign bodies about the Zimbabwean state. And this legislation will effectively remove the capacity of civil society organizations to navigate international discourses, to navigate pushing for change at a regional and international level, and could lead to imprisonment and loss of any formal judicial presence within the Zimbabwean civic space. Also, the Private Voluntary Organizations Amendment Act effectively gives the state control over the structures, the financing of CSOs, and will effectively, again, even though the law is still to be signed, the act still to be signed into law by the president, it has already put civil society on the back foot and has pushed them into a defensive position. That's at the kind of legislative level. What we've seen structurally is that the changes in the structural economy of Zimbabwe has also affected the way civil society organizations are able to be sustainable. the massive growing informalization of the economy, where now up to 80–85% of the working population is in the informal sectors, means they don't belong to structured organizations, such as trade unions. Trade unions were absolutely key to the growth of the democratic movement in Zimbabwe from the 1990s. They became central to forming not only an opposition party, but to civil society organizations such as the National Constitutional Assembly, which brought about and fought for constitutional change. And this often what people forget is that as much as there's a crisis in Zimbabwe now, whatever democratic changes took place through the constitutional reform movement, through the government of national unity, was driven by civil society organizations and opposition, who would not have been in that place without it. And so even as the state, and one of the reasons why the state has closed down so much is because of how effective they were in bringing change, even to authoritarian states. And this should always be remembered. And so the challenges now also for civil society are the loss of funding because of the global imperatives, Ukraine, Gaza, and for increasingly right-wing governments in Europe, and of course the crisis of democracy in the US. The funding for civil society organizations has dwindled. And because they don't have access to local resources, because this is largely state controlled, because the private sector also is close to the state in Zimbabwe, they're not able to have sustainable resources. This does mean that we're likely to see a massive closing down further of key organizations in Zimbabwe in the near future. Unfortunately, some of these strategies towards civil society, we see similar trends emerging even in Zambia, where President Hichilema is using the judiciary, parliament, the election process to close down space. And then if you see what's happening in Angola, in Mozambique, where liberation movements increasingly have also closed down spaces for civil society. What we're seeing, therefore, is liberation movements who are reneging on one of the key objectives of the liberation movement, which was human rights, which was democratization. What we're seeing is a consolidation of parties, elite parties, increasing corruption, increasing accumulation of wealth from above through corruption, the use of a redistributive narrative, anti-imperialism, Pan-Africanism, redistribution to justify an authoritarian state, articulating people's narratives around human rights and democracy as regime change agendas from outside, whereas they've been part of the struggle from the beginning and articulating it as coming from outside. And so this narrative of using popular energy to move into other alternative authoritarian positioning is not peculiar to the region. I think it's happening globally, where we see, and Mark will talk, I'm sure, about this, where we see popular protests dissipating and then being moved into right-wing discourses. In the US, most measurably so. And so I think the crisis now is what happens to civil society organizations which are facing economic structures where they're not able to sustain themselves through livelihood strategies. And globally, there seems no alternative at the moment to the right-wing move. The movements on the left which provided those alternatives have dissipated. We're not sure what the left means anymore globally. And so this is a real permanent crisis, a probable crisis, and where the need for new leadership and ideas and discussions is more important than ever. And one of the good things that has come out of Southern Africa recently is the elections in South Africa. Because for two reasons. One, that the ANC accepted its loss of majority without resorting to violence, without discrediting the outcome of the elections, and respecting the Constitution. And this was a key part of what the ANC legacy was about, what the liberation legacy was about. And secondly, that there is a discussion of a national government of national unity which is not being pushed by outside forces such as SADC or the international community, but which is being pushed by internal forces. And that it's problematic. We're not sure where it's going. It's going to have to deal with a whole serious legacy of inequality, ethnic, racial issues. But nevertheless, there is a groundwork for a national discussion which is driven by national forces. And that hopefully will include a broader discussion within civil society. And if something good comes out of this, it does set an alternative message to the region that liberation movements can deal with crisis in different ways. Hardly likely they're going to listen in the near term, certainly not in Zimbabwe, where the sense of ownership of the future is delegated to one party. But it does set a possible alternative route forward. And people should not underestimate that space that's there, because it also can very quickly dissipate. And so people who dismiss this as, you know, the ANC being dragged into a racialized discourse, be careful of that, because that can draw you into other kinds of populism under a racialized discourse, an anti-imperialist discourse, which becomes very authoritarian and itself very racialized and selective. And so I think there's an opportunity, possibility in a regional space where there's very few of these opportunities. And we should make sure that we use the space as much as possible. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you very much, Brian. Brian kept perfectly the time, in fact, 9 minutes out of a potential 15 minutes, but very, very rich input. And I think, Brian, you've flagged some of the themes that we're going to come back to after hearing the other two speakers. You know, one of the things that you touched on, which strikes me about civil society, is that civil society has enormous resources internally, its skills, its connections, its networks, its ideas, etc. But the one thing it doesn't have is power. And similarly, civil society has a history of shifting power when it mobilizes, but ceding power frequently. And not sustaining its interventions in a way that can continue to shape the democratic trajectory, the trajectory towards democracy and human rights. And that came out in your presentation. And I think another issue which we'll come back to, and I'm sure Tanya and Sibongile will reflect on as well, is, you know, this question of leadership in civil society and the politics of civil society. Civil society orients to external politics, but perhaps there are questions internal to civil society about its ability to protect and sustain democracy. So thanks for painting a bit of a depressing picture. And I was also struck because, I mean, you talked about the role of civil society historically in Zimbabwe, but it was very much civil society that helped Chilema to power in Zimbabwe and to win that election. So it's troubling to hear what you just said, that there's now closing civic space and an undermining of civil society in that country as well. So thanks for giving us a taste of the issues as we're facing them in Southern Africa. So now we move to another part of the world, very different in many respects and similar perhaps in other respects, where there's weak and authoritarian states, and increasingly, including where Tanya is located, the threat of war and regional war or spillover of war. Tanya, thank you so much. Over to you. We're very grateful to have you with us here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you for the Nelson Mandela School for including me in this panel. It's a real pleasure. Today, I will be discussing about the state-society organization relationship in Lebanon. So, and then I will take the case study of the Beirut explosion in order to really illustrate how this relationship is developing. So historically, the relationship between civil society organizations and the state in Lebanon can be described as very dynamic and complex. It is really shaped by historical context, by the legal frameworks that are governing civil society organizations in Lebanon, by the socioeconomic conditions and international influences. So whenever we're discussing the state of Lebanon, we're discussing really a weak state. So the characteristics of this weak state is mainly the limited capacity. So this weak state or Lebanon is often struggling to provide basic services, to enforce the law, ensure security. And this is where we have a vacuum that civil society organizations are frequently filling. Whenever we have a crisis, whenever we have a disaster, whenever we have a war, the state is retracting, it is disappearing, and it is civil society organizations who are showing the leadership and who are responding on the ground. The second characteristic of this weak state is really a fragmented authority. So the authority is often fragmented among various political, sectarian groups, and leading to inconsistent policies and uneven implementation of law. The third one is also corruption and mismanagement. There's a high level of corruption and mismanagement, which is further weakening the state institutions, eroding public trust, and necessitating greater involvement from civil society organizations. So in light of this characteristic of the weak state of Lebanon comes the role of the changing role of associations. And really, when we want to understand the state civil society organizations relationship, we can say that it is following an adaptive strategies. These organizations are continually adapting to the political, social, and economic policy of the state through different historical phases. First of all, in the context where civil society organizations are functioning, they are usually filling the governance void. They are always stepping in to fill the void, blurring the lines between state and civil society organizations. During the Civil War, when state infrastructure were destroyed, communitarian or service provision organizations emerged, supported by international funds to provide essential services. During the pandemic, also we had civil society organizations who stepped in order to fill the void. So whenever we have a crisis, the state is disappearing and the organizations are the ones who are filling. The second one that we need to discuss is really the nature of the state. The level of democracy and the legal framework significantly affect civil society role and development. Usually in democratic environment, associations flourish. However, in post-war Lebanon, we saw that service provision associations that were providing services on the ground were operating freely. However, advocacy organizations were facing suppression, limiting their influence and ability to mobilize. So this is where we see a difference in dealing with those organizations. You have the service provision organizations who are working freely. However, the advocacy organizations in Lebanon are always facing this pushback from the community, sometimes the community and sometimes the state. The third one is the legal framework. Whenever we discuss the legal framework of the civil society organizations in Lebanon, we go back to the 1909 Ottoman Law of Association, which provides a liberal framework for association, but really it's very ambiguous and inconsistency. And this is providing a space for the ministries and for the government to interfere, undermining the independence of the CSOs. The socioeconomic development of the state is also, which is characterized by fragmentation and clientelism. So there's an absence of coherent socioeconomic policies that led to the dominance of family and kinship-based CSOs, which are filling the state role in providing essential services. These associations are often tied to political support, undermining the concept of citizenship and contributing to the persistence of clientelism and patronage in society. Whenever we're discussing also this relationship, we need to understand also the role of international donors. So most of the organizations in Lebanon, especially since the 1980s, they are relying on international donors, especially grassroots organizations. And this is enhancing their capacity to operate independently from the state interference. However, post-2000, there has been a decrease in this international donor support, and this has affected a lot the work of civil society organizations on the ground. This is a general background of state civil society organization relationship in Lebanon. When it came to the Beirut explosion, this is where there were the highlight of this relationship, or sometimes this dynamic that sometimes is characterized by tension. So just to give you a little bit of background about the Beirut explosion, it was on August 4, 2020. It was one of the largest non-nuclear explosions in history, causing extensive damage, significant casualties, and widespread displacement. The state's response to this catastrophic event was inadequate. So there was a total absence of the state. In the immediate aftermath of the explosion, the state response was slow, poorly coordinated. There was lack of immediate medical aid, emergency services. There was a whole bureaucratic inefficiency, lack of preparedness within the state institution. The government resigned. So the explosion triggered a wave of political resignation, including the cabinet, creating a political vacuum. There was a highlight of public distrust from the government. So the state's failure to prevent the explosion significantly eroded public trust. Citizens started a mass call not to support the government, for international organizations to provide the money directly either to the people or to civil society organizations bypassing the state. So here there was the major mistrust between the state and the people, where civil society organizations stepped in. So this is where civil society organizations' role in filling the void, showing leadership. Whenever the crisis happened, rapid mobilization and immediate relief happened. CSOs and grassroots organizations rapidly mobilized to provide humanitarian aid. They established clinics, distributed food and water, offered shelter. We saw thousands of volunteers coordinated by CSOs engaged in the cleanup operation, medical assistance. This grassroots mobilization was crucial in addressing immediate needs and mitigating the impact of the state absence. There was a coordination and resource management showing transparency and accountability. Many CSOs emphasized the transparency and accountability in their operations versus where people were losing trust of the state and the state institutions. This approach helped rebuild some measure of public trust and confidence in civil society organizations' ability to manage the crisis. Also, civil society organizations played a pivotal role in advocating for accountability and justice. They organized protests, called for investigations, demanded that those responsible for the negligence leading to the explosion be held accountable. Many CSOs also engaged in policy advocacy, proposing reform to prevent future disasters and improving governance. This really, in a conclusion, there was an innovative response from the civil society organization. It showcased how civil society organization can mobilize quickly and effectively in the face of state absence. This really built trust between the citizens and the NGOs. However, there is a huge challenge that organizations are facing nowadays, especially financial constraints and political pressures. When it comes to service provision, the organizations are provided with the free space to function. However, when it comes to advocacy and pushing the boundaries, this is where the state is closing down on the space of organizations. I'll stop here and then maybe I'll open the floor, or we'll continue during the questions and answers.
Thanks very much, Tanya. Again, keeping to time, but also a very rich presentation and issues that you are touching on. I'm just picking up a few things. The point that you make about the agility of civil society to respond to crises, which you identify in Lebanon, but which I think is a global phenomenon. We see it here in South Africa and in many other countries where there's a crisis. It's civil society that often moves in quickly to provide relief, and it fills a role of the state there. But as you say, when it comes to demanding accountability and transparency and policy advocacy, it is less welcome. I think you picked up another important issue, which is the role of the state. Obvious to a discussion on state-civil society relations, but an apparent paradox, which is that weakening states leads to increasing authoritarianism. And how do we understand that? And how do we understand the fact that I think civil society wants strong states, but we need strong states for delivery, for protecting human rights, for protecting people against corporate predatory behaviors which are going on all over the world. So there's a real broth of issues that you're pointing to, and which face yourselves in Lebanon as well as in other parts of the world. And then the last thing, two things you touched on, we'll come back to later, picked up by Brian as well, the role of international donors and how receding, that's the right word, diminishing funding has an effect on closing civic capability. After international donors have done a lot over the years to build up a dependency on themselves and then pull the rug from underneath. And you also touched on this question of legal frameworks for civil society and how they can enhance or undermine state civil society relations. So Tanya, thank you so much for those opening comments. Now we'll move to Sibongile and Dashe. And as I said in the introduction, Sibongile is going to bring us back to civil society in Africa, but particularly civil society in relation to women, to gender, to women's human rights and the role of the state in relation to these critical issues. So Sibongile, thank you so much, and over to you.
Okay. Thank you very much. I had two things that I was going to talk about, but I am just going to focus on one today. And that's going to be the sixth administration, which is a period between 2019 and 2024 of the social movements that are working on gender-based violence and femicide in South Africa and how they engaged with that administration. And I'm using that as an illustration to make a point about three key things. South Africa went through a very challenging sixth administration, and which has brought us to this political moment, the dawn of the unknown. One of the things that happened during that, as the administration, the sixth administration came into being in 2019, there was a new movement that came to organize specifically on gender-based violence and femicide. Now, South Africa has a rich history of social movements that has advocated over the past couple of decades on a whole range of issues, really using the courts to hold the states to account to the constitutional promise. One of the things that we began to see as Parliament failed to exercise oversight and the executive also failing to be as robust as it had once been in the early 1990s, that a lot of work was given to the courts. So the courts became the last line of defense, and that really opened up the judiciary to all manner of attacks. But this was mostly because the other branches of governments had been failing, and civil society ended up using the courts most of the time in order to get the state to respond. So one of the questions was, is there another way to engage the state outside of the courtrooms? And so many people were quite excited by the movement of the total shutdown in 2018, which was towards the end of the fifth administration. What happens then is, as the sixth administration starts, there's something that looks like a political mobilization opportunity, because you have a presidency that looks like it is willing to engage and respond. So from 2018 until now, there has been 2 presidential summits on gender-based violence and femicide. And to many people, this looks encouraging because whilst many social movements were facing restrictions, the closure of civic space, departments that were not listening, not willing to collaborate on a number of social issues, there looked like there was one sector that was able to engage and making inroads. But this was more complex than that, because the lesson in these 6 years of engaging with the past administration really tells us that power can co-opt the language of social movements so that it begins to look like it is responsive. Immediately after the march of the 1st of August in 2018 that presented the South African government with a list of 24 demands, which was a roadmap to saying that this is what the state needed to respond to. The key issue was the issue of coordination of the response, which in a context where over 2 decades, there have been a number of strategic plans on gender-based violence and femicide, the numbers just kept on going up. It didn't look like there was any solution. So one of the initial diagnoses was that the fragmented response, the lack of coordination and accountability was one of the things that whatever future or emerges, it's one of the things that needed to be responded to. So here we have a presidency that says, yes, we are going to work together. There's an interim steering committee that's put together, and there is a national strategic plan that comes as a result of that engagement. This all happens right as the world is going through the COVID period. So the National Strategic Plan is launched in April of 2020. Parliament is convened a number of times during this period, and it is asked to prioritize the response to gender-based violence and femicide. There is a commitment to develop a legislation that focuses on setting up the Council on Gender-Based Violence and Femicide. And once again, the 24 demands that comes from the movement of the total shutdown are put as priorities. The first summit has a declaration. You have a number of civil society formations that are engaging, and they are part of the interim steering committee, because there is no space for government to engage with the sector. But there is an agreement that this interim steering committee is going to happen. Civil society is here and happy to see that its demands are being met. But whenever the quarterly stats on crime come up, we are seeing the reporting levels are going down, but the actual situation does not improve. In this context, there is a play that is happening between civil society and government. You have a presidency that is completely powerless to act against various government departments that are not doing what it is that has been promised. And as civil society, there is no good guy when there are no outcomes. You can't have a presidency that is saying it's the Department of Women or the Department of Social Development that is not doing what it is supposed to do, because from where we are sitting, we have a state that is still unable to respond. In 2022, after everything had happened, the COVID restrictions are being lifted. You have a presidency that invites civil society that is struggling with a summit fatigue to say, we understand that we have a plan that is for 10 years. We have lost 2.5 years. Let us meet to fast track, accelerate, and amplify so that we are able to make up for the time that we lost during COVID. This is an exciting moment for civil society that is also challenged by using the courts because of the lack of a trickle-down effect from the progressive decisions like the development of feminist jurisprudence that is unable to make a dent in the scourge. And what is exciting about this moment is to say there are models for accountability where civil society can engage with the state. Over 7 government ministers commit, they attend the summit, they send their highest kind of representatives. They engage in clinics, in caucuses. There is a 6-month fast track plan that is agreed upon. And this is one of the most exciting moments that we are going to have a 6-month fast track plan. We are going to have a 24 months fast track plan. And we are going to meet the key deliverables in terms of what it is that's in the National Strategic Plan. Because the National Strategic Plan really carries the hopes and the aspirations of what many people who worked in the sector believed has an opportunity for the first time to respond in a way that actually makes sense. Fast track to where we are right now. The report of the summit was never launched, although it was finalized. The engagement was disbanded between civil society and unceremoniously. And there was a signing spree in the 2 weeks before the elections. And the council legislation was one of those things. It had none of the things that civil society had asked for and insisted, agreed to, that were in the 6-month fast track plan. More importantly, the issue of the coordination of the response. It's not in the legislation. The creation of the fund to resource the legislation, the intergovernmental cooperation, which is needed. So the key points that I would like to surface in here is that civil society is going to experience various administrations differently. And even at the same time, you are going to have different social movements experiencing the same administration differently. Whilst some people may have levels of engagement and other people are not going to do that. And there are quite a number of things that are going to impact on what are the opportunities that enable that, because these are the opportunities that helps us to make the decision on whether we are engaging politically or whether we are engaging legally through the courts. When we make these decisions, we make these decisions out of trust, but it is not blind trust, because when we work with the state, we understand that the state can be the state and put us in a state. But as civil society, and some of the questions that we are seeking to answer today, how we organize ourselves is going to be an important thing as we are waiting for this new administration to tell us how it intends to work. The movement of the total shutdown aimed to surface Black women leadership of the sector because the issues of race, class, and gender are a perennial tension point in how the sector has been organized since the dawn of post-liberation. The work around who produces knowledge, whose bodies are used as evidence, are still some of the issues that fractures the ways in which we seek to organize ourselves and also to do advocacy. Organizing is increasingly becoming hostile, and the polarization is there are groups within civil society that believes in building a broad-based church and others who believe in pure politics, that these are the only people that we can or cannot work with. And in the sector of gender and sexuality, we are basically seeing the anti-rights actors, in some quarters called anti-gender movement, that are in our countries. And one of the things I'd like to raise is that these aren't necessarily anti-gender, these are anti-rights, these are anti-democracy. And what we are seeing with the access to funding, most of these groups are linked to what's happening in the global north, the right-wing governments that are taking over, that are making decisions around foreign aid, what's funded and what's not funded. And that is really impacting on how civil society is able to engage. But anti-rights actors are dangerous and really force us to think about how we organize, because unlike people who wanted to present a different or alternative narrative, anti-rights actors are throwing everything up in the air and telling us that nothing is known, so there are no rights. The way we think about gender is flawed. Democracy shouldn't. This is happening as we are seeing the weakening and the dismantling of multilateralism. And all of these things are connected. So part of the bigger challenges that we would have to grapple with in order to lead or to be led in civil society is to really think about what does it mean for us to engage in a context where people are depoliticized, or where civil society is asked to acquire new tools of engaging, when the difference between what is taught in the classroom about what a court system is or international human rights system is, when those systems themselves are captured. So what I'm asking for is the intentionality around understanding that our biggest work at the moment is closing the gap between what is and what should be, in that the mechanisms that we engage with, be it the courts, be it the states, be it the international systems of protection, that they themselves are fit for purpose, because we can have all the tools to engage, but if we are talking to a compromised court, if we are talking to a compromised African Commission, our ability to do the work that we are trained to do does not mean much. They cannot help us to hold states to account if they themselves are captured or they are threatened their independence by what the member states actually want. And I think that is where most of us who are doing, whether it's transnational or local movement, is trying to get states and institutions that are not fit for purpose to do the work that we hope they were set up to do, but they are increasingly unable to do that. So I am going to stop there for now.
So much, Sibongile. Again, enormously rich and challenging and thought-provoking. What you've said. Touching on again issues about state capability. For civil society and the state to work effectively together at delivery on human rights and protection of human rights, you need a capable state. But if you have an incapable state, it's very difficult to make that happen. But you've also, Sibongile, touched on internal fragmentation and differences within the state. We often think as if the state is homogeneous, but you will find people who want to cooperate and people who don't want to cooperate in the same party, in the same department. You touched on this problem of being co-opted, or if not being co-opted, at times going into processes in good faith that appear to be about change, and then finding that those processes involve civil society in endless hours of meetings and summits and conferences and submissions and processes and achieve nothing at all, or achieve nothing except demobilizing civil society movements. That civil society often acts on the premise of good faith to find that the state acts in bad faith for whatever reason it may be. So, we're having this discussion in the context of a university, and it's very clear that there's a vast field of civil society studies that needs to be looked into. Before we open up for questions and discussion, I do want to ask one question to each of the three people, and just for very brief responses because of the kind of theme of where we're trying to go with these webinars. I mean, it strikes me that civil society spends a lot of its time tackling symptoms and not systems. And the consequence is that civil society is capable of winning important reforms, but not holding the space for those reforms. Civil society's mandate is often around inequality and equality, and yet, despite all the efforts and the work that has gone on, inequality has widened over recent decades, and the widening of inequality has provided the fuel for populism and authoritarianism. So I'd like you to just very briefly, each of you, perhaps going back to Brian and then Tanya and then Sibongile, would you just reflect, but briefly, on this question of civil society leadership? What can we do? Is there a problem with civil society leadership? And I don't say that in a pejorative way. I'm not questioning the activists, but for example, sometimes it feels to me, Sibongile mentioned depoliticization. Sometimes it feels to me that civil society leadership lacks politics. It lacks time to analyze environments, to properly strategize, that its modus operandi is frequently determined by donors and behaviors that have been created by donors rather than world politics as it is today. So will you just briefly, because I know it's a huge subject, and I do want to open up for questions and brief inputs, but Brian, Tanya, and then Sibongile, just flag issues, if you like, that you think warrant further thought and discussion.
Thank you, Mark. Yeah, I think it's a key question. Clearly, there are problems with civil society leadership. We see that all around the continent and globally. Both depoliticization, accountability within their own organizations to their communities, the fact that they're also worried about their job security, so there's competition for funding, lack of cooperation between civil society organizations. That is part of the crisis that we're facing. But in terms of the broader ability to link symptoms to systems, this links up with some of the issues that have been raised in the questions there about how do you deal with financiers of authoritarianism who also finance civil society. Secondly, how do you foster cross-movement alliances? And I think that brings us to the question of how do we build a new kind of internationalism? Because I think more and more importantly, our problems are linked globally. That whatever we're able to do at the national, regional level, as with the funding, and as about that question, is about what happens in other countries. And what we've seen is the loss of a progressive internationalism, where we don't know what the alternatives to the current international system are. And that means that people then get drawn into very particular struggles, very parochial struggles around survival strategies, where they don't know what a structural change looks like. Because also if they get drawn into political relations, that often gets them co-opted into those systems. Because the alternatives in the political sphere are also very weak. We know that in opposition politics, there's a lot of weakness. In Zimbabwe, there's a huge problem internally within the opposition: accountability, leadership, alternative strategies, not personalizing that political leadership. So it is a huge problem. It's not going to be an easy answer. But I think one of the key issues that these raises is that we do need cross alliances across civil society, but also new discussions about internationally. How do we influence also what goes on in other countries which affects us nationally, such as funding? Because unless we build those new alliances, we will get stuck in these parochial situations where we're dealing with particular issues, not dealing with structural questions, and not building alternative views about what's possible.
Thank you, Brian. Tanya.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the question, Mark. And actually, I want to stress on what Brian was saying. So I have 3 major points to discuss based on this question. First of all, you have the competition on the grants and the donors agenda. This is mainly setting the scene on what organizations are working on. So you have like, if it's gonna be most of the grants that are coming or the donors they are focusing on service provision. So this is in the first thing we need to discuss the donors and the international donors agenda. The second is the role of the state. So most of the state is doing is really pushing back. So whenever you have leadership inside organizations, they want to change, they want to advocate, you see the state pushing back, either co-opting the work, or sometimes this is a new strategy or strategy that the state is using is including those civil society activists or actors within the government, or asking them to become ministers, so they become from within. So they're not anymore pushing back the role of the state or pushing the state for change. They are becoming from within the system. And this is in a way also stopping advancing leadership and advancing the role of advocacy within the sector. The third thing is the crisis. So in Lebanon, if we see the trends of civil society organizations or the role of civil society organization, it is always changing. So whenever we have a crisis, all the organizations that are working on leadership, that are working on agenda setting, on advocacy, on pushing for policies, they are stopping their work and they're focusing more on service provision. So every time we have a crisis, all the organizations are stopping what they are doing. They are attracting grants that are more coming for service provision, and they are focusing on this. So in a way, you have the environment where they are working. So it's always, you have always crisis. So they are not capable of really pushing for their agendas. You have the state role, who is always trying to co-opt, to push back, and co-opt civil society organizations and the competition on the grants.
Thank you, Tanya. Sibongile.
Right. So one of the things around donor advocacy, so that we can have resilient movements. I think the feminist funders have gotten this right, and I think it's important for other people who are being funded elsewhere to do this level of donor advocacy. Most feminist funds are now giving unrestricted support, which really allows people to imagine, because they say, we want to fund you, like we want you to win. You know, like that's the Black Feminist Fund kind of tagline. And so we are seeing quite a number of donors in the feminist kind of world. And I think this is something that other donors should emulate. And so this level of donor advocacy needs to happen so that we don't keep on coming back and saying it's the donor agenda, you know, that is doing that. So that's a positive where it's happening. We really do need to have time to reflect and learn, because I think sometimes in the implementation of our projects, and whatever programs that we have conceptualized, the time to stand back and say, you know what, I really don't think that this is happening. Or even when something has been done, to come back and actually say this could have, I mean, we have the tick box monitoring and evaluation that most organizations and social movements are subjected to. But the honest reflection where you are not trying to spin your work to the donor, it's something that is consistently kind of missing in our movements. Because if we knew and believe that at any point in time, however amazing we thought our strategy was, it's actually not giving us what we want to do. We need to be able to stop it, you know, and that would not mean that your grant is going to be taken away, but that you are going to be able to just continue doing the work. And finally, I'm actually in Durban now, and this is a feminist space with other kind of feminist activists. And we have conceptualized this as a trust building exercise because we realize that it is extremely hard and it's getting harder to organize, you know, without trust. And just coming into this space, it's just the fear and the anxieties. Many people who have got exhibits, you know, in the Museum of Ideas that failed to launch because of all of this kind of infighting, lack of trust that happens in our movements. So I think there is a call to also just go back to that. There are the big systems, but sometimes we are not able to make the dent on the big isms that are crippling the world because we are just consistently finding it hard to find each other, to agree well, and continue just doing the work that actually happens. There's a lot of infighting in movements. And that's why when we ask where's the progressive left, they're out there kind of fighting themselves. You know, where is this movement? They're out there kind of fighting themselves. And I do think that many people do fight, but our polarization in our organizing, it's basically something that we need to really take time and say, what does it mean to work together? Because we keep on getting stuck. That's okay.
Great comments. I'm going to open up now. I would just ask anybody who has questions or very brief comments. I'm underlining very brief because I'm looking at the time, just to say who you are as well, because we didn't have a chance to do introductions. So if you have a question, say I'm so-and-so from so-and-so. And we're also looking at the questions in the chat. And I'd ask in particular Tanya and Sibongile, who can see them better than I can see them from this distance, to think about those questions for the final round of comments. For example, we have a question, how do we deal with organized crime as a component of authoritarianism, which itself is a very serious question because we tend to think of the world as the state, the private sector, civil society, the judiciary, but there are new players, and organized crime is one of those new players, in a sense, in competition with civil society for a very different type of agenda. So good question there. But can I see if anybody has quick questions? Simon, any others? I'm noting online.
Nolita.
Sorry?
Nolita.
Nolita online. Okay, let's take Simon first, whilst I try and then Masi, and then I'll read out Nolita's question.
Great, thank you. So I'm Simon Mason from the Economic Development Partnership, or the EDP. Building on what Sibongile was mentioning at the end around kind of infighting and dissonance within the movements, I wanted to just ask around the role of intermediary organizations and partnership building organizations. And the EDP that I work for is one of these organizations that kind of tries to bridge the gap between CSOs and the state. I wanted to just find out what your thoughts are, and in other countries in Africa, if there have been successes there, we're not very familiar with what the role of intermediaries have been in other countries, and I'm quite interested to hear about kind of case studies in that regard. Not only to Sibongile, sorry, I'm asking it to the whole panel.
Thanks, Simon. Masigolele. And if you're going to ask a question, just come forward and.
Probably the comments and the question. At the start of the conversation, I was of the impression that we will be speaking more around what's happening internally within civil society, but the speakers focused more on government and international donors up until you asked the question about leadership. And that's one of the most intriguing things. We have a room full of activists, but when we put forward questions around civil society, we're pointing externally. Why is that? Why is that? And then the second part of my comment question is, also just wanted to mention reflections. That's one of the most emptiest spaces within civil society. And as much as we have been spent a lot of times and years trying to hold our government accountable, we don't have such mechanisms. We see this morning that talks about civil society leaders holding governments accountable. But if we have a problem with leadership generally, why should we trust ourselves to hold ourselves accountable within the space? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any other questions in the room? Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you come and
Okay.
just so that the speakers can see and hear you.
My name is Fabio. I am at the African Center of Excellence for Equality Research. I just wanted to ask you guys about a comment that Brian made in the absence of an alternative model that is global to an extent. How is that affecting the capacity of achieving success in organizations? Because at the end, the frame is patriarchal, is capitalistic, is exploitative, is not sustainable. Because there's no alternative option that has enough muscle to present something else. So how to operate? Because at the end, like the left seems to be trying to work within a framework of capitalism, as opposed to a different model of society. So just a question.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you, guys.
You'll also acknowledge the camera.
Thank you guys for your presentation. Quite awesome views coming from you. I just have a question for Sibongile. So as we're discussing civil society, and I must say it's actually a space that I quite respect a lot, because some of the socio-political gains we've made and advancements we've made in South African society today were primarily driven by civil society. For example, the important work that was done by the Treatment Action Campaign in order to roll out HIV treatment in South Africa and so on. So I think one of my interesting contestations about civil society is how civil society, in the way it functions and it's governed, its ability to actually reproduce some of the oppressions that we witness in society generally. And I think an example I would actually like to make is Equal Education. You know, it's a very important organization that has been able to advance the struggles that come about in terms of attaining education. But what actually transpired and what actually shocked me was some of the women actually coming out from that organization to say that they have experienced, sexism and gender-based violence and being sexually assaulted. And that was a complete shock for me, because I did not expect an organization the caliber of Equal Education to actually reproduce some of the oppressions that we witness in South African society. So my question to Sibongile is, how rampant is that in civil society organizations in South Africa, or maybe in Africa generally? And what are some of the mechanisms that are at our disposal to make sure that these things do not surface in civil society? Thank you.
Thank you for a very important question. Gina, can we bring Nolita in? I see that she has her hand up. Yes. Nolita, you're welcome to ask your question or comment.
Thank you so much, comrade. Good morning to everybody and the panelists. I am so much relieved that we have this conversation today, because Sibongile and I come a long way. We've been trained by the Legal Resources Center, and we went out into the world. I am now with the Treatment Action Campaign. But what I want to understand is around the electoral system that we have, because we have discussed this several times. It is not working for South Africa. We must remember, we are an African country without a name. And if we say we are South Africa, we don't know who we are. And yet we come now, we have a GNU. And this GNU, it's not even panning out, because it's been days. They have not even had the cabinet. nominations. So what I'm saying is, with civil society, as much as we are divided, it's because we have this dwindling funding that is happening throughout. So how do we come together? We used to have a civil society that was united pre-1994, but now we are post-1994. The civil society is no longer united. So I want us to find workable solutions whereby we can come together as civil society. Thank you.
Thanks, Nolita. Okay, before I go back to the speakers, Petunia, can you just scroll to the very last question? I noted one. The incapacity of the state to respond is a great concern for civil society organization. What is or could be the role of civil societies in the government of national unity? What opportunities are presented by this political shift? And how can civil society position itself to redefine its relationship with the state? That's a question Sibongile and Brian might want to just possibly reflect on as well in the context of South Africa at the moment. Any other questions? Okay, if not, well, thanks. That's a rich set of questions. It's 11:45, so we have 15 minutes left. So I'm going to ask each of the speakers to take a few minutes. There's some big and complex questions, including about looking inwards into civil society organization. And depending on how long you take, but it can't be more than 4 minutes each. We'll see if there's time for a final round, but I doubt it. But we'll go the way we've been going. Brian, Tanya, and then Sibongile.
Thanks, Mark. I'll only deal with a couple of things because there's not enough time. The first is the opportunities that are here with the GNU. I think what the opportunity is that all of these, as with all of these kind of political struggles, these parties are all looking to establish their influence in the GNU, good or bad. But what it does mean, it leaves them open to other influences if they're trying to influence their position in the GNU. It may open up opportunities for civil society organizations to have discussions, to be able to strengthen their positions within the GNU. It won't last for very long, but there might be an opening here to say to you, you're all vulnerable in this GNU. It's time for you to start looking at your citizenry again. How do we engage to make this GNU a practically more, a better alternative for the citizenry? The bigger question, the one you raised, the global alternative, that for me is something we really need to think about now increasingly. About how do you, in Gramsci's terms, create a new hegemonic framework? How do you have a narrative that is able to draw people's complaints, their demands into a narrative which links livelihoods, which links rights questions, which links redistribution questions, which links gender questions into an alternative narrative which can't get captured by the rights. That, for all its weaknesses in the past, that elements of the left were able to do that. Elements of the international movement were able to do that. The labor movement, we don't have that now, especially because of the decline of the labor movement. And so the question is, in these new frameworks of informalization, what are going to be the new possibilities for building? And that's where I think CSOs can begin to have a discussion. And especially in times of uncertainty now for the GNU, what can you inject into this discussion at national level? And so the coming together and critical inflection of what's going on in CSOs now is more important than ever. I'll start there.
Thank you very much, Brian. Tanya.
Yes, thank you, Mark. I'll take a couple of minutes to discuss the future of civil society organizations. So in the region as well as everywhere in the world, I think civil society organizations need to reposition themselves and move beyond the comfort zone of service provision and beyond the idea of competing over external funds and competing over grants. they need to coordinate, work together on setting the agenda for change. So they need to move beyond service provision, but beyond the day-to-day NGOization of the work, and work towards more leadership and coordination together. I think that, and they should be the ones setting the agenda for the future and setting the agenda for the state.
Thank you very much, Tanya. Sibongile.
We have more ways of communicating and engaging now than we did before. And we have information overload. It's really hard to know sometimes what is going on in terms of the organizing that's happening. So I do think how we are coordinating the number of things. I'll make an example with the African Union reforms, which President Kagame started in 2016. There has been now at the last summit, an instruction basically to wrap the process up by February of 2025. Civil society has not engaged with this. There are very few transnational movements or movements. Everything in the African Union is up for grabs, and African citizens are not engaged, with this process. This is a process that says we have a big AU, it needs to be smaller. And what we are seeing, it's a process that has actually been given to accounting law firm. And what's happening is basically not a reform process, it's a deforming process, because it's basically like cutting, in order to cut costs. So I'm using this example for us to say, what is it? What are the key things that we should all be? Of course, we all come from where we come from. We work in education, we work in prison reforms and whatever. Transnational organization or national organizing, what is the things that can bring us all together? Because we must have an interest in whatever, it is. Right now, if in South Africa, the question is around the GNU, then we should all be able to kind of position ourselves. But our ways of organizing have to understand these. What does it mean to come together, in order to organize? Because sometimes part of the fractures are there's so much expectations that is placed on organizers, the people who create the space, the people who hold the space to meet the demands of the people, and sometimes beyond what the coalition or whatever alliance is supposed to bring, together. So I think civil society can and should be, accountable. And there are many ways of doing that. And so I'm just trying to wrap up like a number of questions that we asked in a similar kind of a vein. Whether we are talking about sexual harassment or whatever it is that is wrong, leaders that are unaccountable, it's fraud, it's corruption, but civil society is basically a part of the society, that we have. And so whatever it is that's happening in society is replicated there. So the tools that we use to hold others to account are the same tools that should be used to hold other people to account, whether it's government, whether it's other civil society organizations. But there has been an attempt, and I do remember, because in the wake of the equal education conversation, there were other things that were happening in other organizations, like where Nolita and I met 25 years ago, the Legal Resources Center. Quite a number of organizations were coming up with similar things of how women are treated in these organizations. And I think when there is a spotlight, we don't kind of close and then let's open ourselves up into all of those things, because we have no credibility as civil society if we want to hold others to account, but we are basically saying that we should not be. And we see this in opposition. Opposition says this government is not doing well, and they are sitting there for 30 years, and they're also not changing their leadership. So it's that level of hypocrisy that leads to a lack of believability, I think, in our societies when we want to hold others to a different standard from that we believe we shouldn't be kind of hold up to. So I think this is something that everyone has to do. It's not something that belongs to specialists or anyone else. And there are many ways, and we are seeing young people using tech, conversations that are very thoughtful to really try and strengthen our civil society. And I think I'm just going to kind of stop there, but it's something that cannot just be relegated or left to a few people in society. All of us have a responsibility.
Thank you very much, Sibongile, and thank you everybody for the questions and comments. If I can just, in closing, make a few brief comments to try and sum up what's come out of this discussion. And thank you to everybody who's been here and the over 40 people who were online. Brian talked about the need to create a new hegemonic framework. Civil society is often masterful at critique, less effective at construction, and at holding up galvanizing visions that are believable and possible, and that mobilize. Tanya talked about the need for CSOs to reposition themselves. And whilst I think everybody in the room would agree with that, the question I would ask is, does civil society uniformly agree it needs to reposition itself? Linked to what Sibongile said about the lack of space to reflect, civil society sometimes continues with strategies whose expiry date went several years before, because the political and social environment changed. And I've seen that in my own experience in civil society, where we continue to use the courts when the courts were no longer as effective as they were briefly for a few years in the early 2000s. And Sibongile, I like the term, talked about the problems of the trickle down, or the lack of trickle down from the courts. But it points to this question of space for introspection, for critical introspection and reflection. And Sibongile asked the question, and it came out of, I think, the questions that were asked here: what can be done to bring us all together? And for me, that's also a way of saying what can be done to constitute civil society as power. Because civil society, I always feel its greatest weakness is not that it's not powerful, but that it doesn't have power at the end of the day. It doesn't achieve becoming more than the sum of its parts, of its many parts. And that relates to questions asked by a number of people, Masibulele, etc., about civil society behaviors that need to be reconsidered. So I want to just put 4 questions to finish, and not to the speakers because we're out of time, but for all of us to think about going forward, because I hope that these will be a series of conversations. It's not just an academic exercise. I sometimes wonder whether the term civil society is very helpful at all, because it suggests something homogenous where it's not at all. I was at a presentation a few days ago about South Africa in the 1980s and the uprising of the 1980s, which was a civil society uprising, but the term civil society didn't exist in those days. It did exist, but only on the margins. And it certainly wasn't funded in a big way, in the way that it is today. So civil society and the perhaps progressive but unintentional consequences of donors and international donors has encouraged and lulled certain types of behavior that ironically or paradoxically undermine the very mission, the ability to do what civil society says it's intended to do. How do we understand the heterogeneity of civil society? We've talked today as if civil society is all organizations that are involved in advocacy and change, and that they're all progressive, but they're not. In fact, the right part of civil society has hijacked the behaviors of the left in the past and is using them often more effectively than the progressive social justice part of civil society. And civil society, even in itself, has social distance. Sibongile referred to class, race, gender. You know, if you take class, there's 250,000 registered NGOs in South Africa, but most of them are community-based, with very little money, but playing a vital role. But there's very little interaction or communication between what we sometimes call the blue chip NGOs and the community-based organizations, and yet they all stand to benefit from each other. So how do you build bridges within civil society? And then the last question I would say, relevant to the way we've convened today, is what is the role of academia in civil society? I'm sure, you know, Tanya, based in a university as a university researcher and teacher, Brian, Sibongile would have thoughts on that, because I think there's a critical role for academia, both in research and theorizing, but also in trying to fill some of these deficits that we have that we've identified. So, and somebody says, Nolita says, we really need to revisit this Western democracy. And Caleb says, I hope my question will one day be effectively answered, but I've lost sight of Caleb's question. Caleb, we will come back to your question, but time is up. I'm sorry, the discussion really, Sibongile, Tanya, Brian, I want to thank all of you. Your presentations were outstanding and very thought-provoking, and we're very grateful for them. I want to thank everybody who's attended in person and online, and Dineo, Petunia, Valeska, and others who have played a critical role in conceptualizing and promoting this discussion today. My appeal is that this is not the end, because these are such vital questions and would benefit, in fact, from a whole seminar series where we break down some of the questions that have been asked today and interrogate them question by question with the kind of caliber of speakers that we've had today. So I hope I haven't left anything out, but thank you very, very much, everybody, and good luck with your work. And that brings it to an end, unless I've forgotten anything. Petunia, have I forgotten anything?
That's all from this room. There'll be refreshment outside.
And there'll be refreshments outside. Thank you.